something about that makes you want to stand up, really look at each other in the eye, and offer each other hope and guidance for the journey forward. But that last line, if people say no, I'm going to go anyhow, really is a line that leads us into the next great woman we're going to talk about today. And you can see her picture on the screen. This is Viola Liuzzo. And so both of these women, Frances and Viola, had their own journeys to try to restore justice as part of their mission for what it meant to simply be a human being alive in the world. So how many of you were teens or young adults in 1965? Do you have a memory of reading or watching what was going on in the South for that really, really dire struggle for rights? If you're younger, maybe you've seen old footage or even watched the movie Selma. How many of you watched the movie Selma? Right? So you have some idea of the terror that it meant to really put your life on the line, to try to give people the simple right to vote, right? To just uphold the Voting Rights Act. So the role of Unitarian Universalists in the struggle to advocate for equity is a story that needs to be understood better and even revisited as we're grappling today with some of the same issues. We're looking at mass incarceration. We're looking at unfair treatment in medical centers and healthcare. We're looking at mass incarceration. And in researching this sermon, I came back to our fifth principle, over and over again. The right of conscience and the use of the democratic process within our congregations, but within society at large. Now, when I first joined a UU church 25 years ago, this principle was really a curiosity for me. I remember thinking, why does the democratic process need to be explicitly stated in a religion? I was new to the Free Church. I had grown up, I was raised Presbyterian, so everything was by the Presbytery. But over the years of my involvement as a lay person, as staff, and then as a minister, this principle, the right of conscience, and the importance of the democratic process, has really become one of the bedrocks of my ministry. The Reverend Earl Holt III states in the book With Purpose and Principle, democracy is an expression of faith in the power of human beings to shape their own lives, a faith that is most explicit in the ideals of our Unitarian Universalist religious tradition. Now, these are very powerful words that we use to underpin our social activism efforts, especially those that involve non-violent action. And this was the goal, of course, of the March in Selma, of Dr. Martin Luther King, this idea of non-violent action. One of our denomination's most celebrated historians is the Reverend Dr. Mark Morrison Reed, and he is a scholar of Black Unitarian Universalist history. And he published the book, The Selma Awakening, How the Civil Rights Movement Tested and Changed Unitarian Universalism in 2014. And this is really an excellent book if you like history. This book chronicles the relationship between the UUA's, our association's leadership and membership, with the historic events that led up to the Voting Rights March in Selma. In his book, he states that the March in Selma presented a real test for Unitarian Universalists. The test was, did freedom merely mean freedom of belief and conscience? Or did it also include civic, political, and economic freedoms that the educated, middle-class, liberal religious constituency took for granted? In other words, did our reasons for being in this fight and for marching hinge on the need to enact our belief in the democratic process in human relations? There are both joys and sorrows in our denomination's relationship with anti-racism efforts in this fifth principle. We can be proud of the fact that both Unitarians and Universalists were strident in their calls to end slavery in the 1800s. We know that Francis Watkins Harper worked with many of those Unitarians and Universalists. We can be proud of the fact that busloads of UUs, over 1,600, attended the March on Washington, D.C. in 1963. We can be proud that 177 of our ministers and seminarians journeyed to Selma and Montgomery to march in 1965. No one can deny the significance of the events in Selma to galvanize our denomination around the issues of voting rights, the fundamental component of citizenry in a democratic society. March 7th, 1965 is known as Bloody Sunday in American history. On that Sunday in Selma, Alabama, 600 African-American marchers attempted to cross the Pettus Bridge, heading toward the state capital, Montgomery. The citizens were clubbed, tear-gassed, and trampled by Alabama state troopers and deputized men, many Klansmen. The violence, what was new was that this violence was really caught by TV cameras. So this shame and the way that citizens of America were being treated, it was really brought to living rooms, not only in America, but around the world. So this was a global shame. Early Monday morning, the next day on March 8th, Dr. King sent a telegram to clergy leaders all around the country asking them to come to Selma and march, to come to Selma to protest in a non-violent way. Within 2 days, 60 of our Unitarian and Universalist ministers had made the pilgrimage. That was about 10% of our ordained clergy at the time. And on Tuesday, March 9th, defying a court injunction not to march, Dr. King led a group of about 2,500 marchers to the entrance of the Pettus Bridge. After praying and discerning, Dr. King decided not to march that day, and the group returned to Brown Chapel. Brown Chapel was kind of the hub. It was where all the hospitality, where all the communication was taking place in Selma. That night, after dinner at Walker's Cafe, the Unitarian minister James Reeb and 2 colleagues were called. Each called their homes to say goodnight to their wife and children, to assure them that they had made it through the day safely and they were going to walk back home to home hospitality that was being offered by citizens of Selma. They left the cafe and they took a shortcut to go back to Brown Chapel, and several white locals raced out of an alley and began beating the ministers. James Reeb, as many of you know, was hit in the head with a baseball bat. He was taken to the hospital, but he died 3 days later in Birmingham, in the medical center in Birmingham. After the death of James Reeb, hundreds of Unitarian Universalists raced down to Selma to attend his memorial service and to stick around for really what was becoming the march of the century and really a defining moment in America, a defining moment in not only American politics, but American religious life and American social life. So how did this woman, how did Viola Liuzzo, a 39-year-old homemaker, student, and activist from Detroit, Michigan, find herself in Selma? Viola was not born into Unitarianism or Universalism. Her life had not been an easy one either. She grew up impoverished in Tennessee and Georgia, the daughter of a coal miner and a school teacher in the Great Depression. She had firsthand experience of living in the Jim Crow South as a white person and seeing the terror and the humiliation people of color faced. When she was 17, her family moved to Ypsilanti, Michigan to look for work. And she soon moved to Detroit to find a job, and she started working in a cafeteria. And that was the same time she met a woman named Shere Evans, who was African American, and Shere became her best friend and her children's second mother. At age 18, Viola had married and had 2 children, later divorcing and marrying Jim Liuzzo, who was her husband at the time of the march in Selma. And she had 3 more children with Jim, so she's the mother of 5 children. And by all accounts, Viola was a really devoted mother and a citizen who was very caring to anyone that she met. She gave away so much money that Jim would scold her that they sometimes wouldn't have enough money for their mortgage or their grocery, but if she saw a person in need, she had grown up very poor, and if she saw a person in need, she wanted to help them. She took her children camping and rock climbing. She played classical music in the phone. She was very curious and strong-willed, and she always regretted her decision to drop out of high school when she was only 14. And so at age 38, she entered Wayne State University. And it was there that she was introduced to and fell in love with the writings of Plato and Emerson and Thoreau. And Viola was deeply, deeply impressed with Thoreau. She loved nature, and she really loved Thoreau's unconventional stance on public issues. In his essay, Civil Disobedience, Viola read, "There are thousands who are in opinion opposed to slavery, yet who in effect do nothing to end it, who, esteeming themselves children of Washington and Franklin, sit down with their hands in their pockets and say that they don't know what to do, and so they do nothing." She really carried these words and the sentiment behind this observation that Thoreau made of 19th century abolitionism into the fight for civil rights of her generation. She was a woman of action, and to do nothing was not her way. At her time at Wayne State, she had met many young people who had been freedom riders, and she was really fascinated with what had happened in the South the summer of 1964. And she'd also joined First Unitarian Detroit, which was a real hotbed of social activism at that time. So when she saw the events of Bloody Sunday in her living room, she really felt the call to go to the South. On March 16th, she called her husband, Jim, from Wayne State campus, and she told him, "I'm going to drive to Selma." He begged her to at least come home and say goodbye to the children, but she really said, "Nope, I'm leaving right now. I've got the fire in me." Jim asked if he could come with her, and she said, "No, this is something I want to do on my own." So she drove 3 days and 3 nights, over 1,000 miles to get to Selma. And historians have looked for records, receipts at hotels, and they can't find any. And so a lot of historians believe that she just kind of slept in her car. She would pull over and sleep in her car. Remember, she wasn't a woman of great means. And she arrived Friday afternoon, so that would have been at the end of the week. And she immediately began working the hospitality table at Brown Chapel. And she boarded with the Jackson family. And in a few short days, she had made arrangements for their daughter, teenage daughter, to go back with her to Detroit to get an education and maybe have a better life. Viola also donated her car for voter registration, and she had volunteered to drive the marchers to and from Selma once the rally had concluded. After marching to the Montgomery State Capitol, Viola and a young Selma native, Leroy Moten, ferried the marchers from Montgomery back to Selma. It was 7 p.m. when they teamed up to make their last ride from Selma to Montgomery to pick up any stragglers. And this was really key because the situation was really very, very dangerous. President Johnson had federalized 1,800 Alabama National Guardsmen and sent 2,000 additional troops and 100 FBI agents to Montgomery to provide backup safety for the marchers. But the marchers had been urged and coached to really get out of Montgomery the minute that rally concluded. So they needed a lot of people to get people out of there because it was very dangerous. And so there were all of these very elaborate exit plans to get the Northerners who had come down to the airports, to bus depots, to get them out, because the National Guard was leaving at 9 p.m. And after that, there would be no security. And the state and local police were very well aware of these orders. And only a skeleton crew would be there, but we also know that there was a lot of collusion and collaboration between the local law enforcement and the Klan. So driving along Route 80, Viola and Leroy were boxed in by 2 cars carrying Klansmen and an FBI informant in the car. And to this day, no one knows who fired the shots, but Viola was instantly killed that night. The men in the cars were tried twice and found not guilty, both times by all white juries. And so this was justice for a white woman in Alabama who dared to have a black man sitting in front of her car with her. And Viola's family really disintegrated after the murder. Death threats were made at her home in Detroit. Her husband Jim had to he had to pay for around-the-clock security. The children had to switch schools because they were bullied and harassed. And the FBI began a smear campaign against Viola to cover up the fact that an FBI informant had been in the car and may have even been the trigger man. So they started this smear campaign that we know very well. I mean, it's become a huge part of the Me Too movement, but when someone is doing the right thing, it's very easy to smear them and say things like, why was she not with her family? Why wasn't she being a good mother and staying at home? Why was she alone in a car with a man who wasn't her husband? So they started this smear campaign. And after her death, the chaplain at Wayne State said of Viola, she consistently chose the role of a worker. She epitomized the very strong person in the freedom movement who doesn't ask to be a leader. People like her make up the moral backbone of our movements. And just a few years after her death, Viola, like Frances, was virtually forgotten in the civil rights movement. Many folks in that era really believed that a woman's place was in the home. The Unitarian Jack Mendelson writes in The Martyrs, 16 who died for civil rights, when Viola went to Selma, she thought she was serving her family. She didn't think she was leaving her family. She thought she was serving her family because her family was all of us. She understood the interconnectedness between every human being. Her family was mankind. And at the end of the service, you will see a slide of a memorial that is now in Montgomery, and it's a memorial to the 40 civil rights martyrs from that march, and Viola is the only white woman of those 40. So we can see in Viola's life and in Frances's life a model for us. When asked why she wanted to go to the march in Selma, Viola answered, "This is everybody's fight. There are too many people just standing around and talking. I'm going." It was that simple and clear to Viola. And I think all of us here also believe that we have a responsibility to somehow be engaged in the ongoing fight for voter registration, to end mass incarceration, to ensure that people, regardless of their color or their economic level, have hospitalization and decent medical care. Our faith calls us to look at injustice, not turn away. And we all have our own role to play. Frances wrote and lectured. Viola marched. I know that this congregation voted to approve the 8th principle. And I know that you probably had a lot of discussion about why it was important to adopt the 8th principle. I know that you have a strong anti-racism task force here. How do you see yourself being involved in that task force? These are questions that we continue to mull over as we figure out what is the responsibility each one of us has. What does our conscience, that fifth principle, what does our conscience call each of us to do individually to ensure the democratic process in our society? So I invite you, I encourage you, I exhort you to personally and congregationally do what you can to help heal this world. And now I invite you to sing hymn 148, Let Freedom Span Both East and West.